Mr. Prime Minister, the international criticism is massive right now. And now even your closest ally, US President Joe Biden, said, and I quote, Netanyahu is hurting Israel more than he is helping. How does that make you feel?
Well, I don't know exactly what the president meant. But if he meant by that I'm pursuing private policies against the majority, the wish of the majority of Israelis, and that this is hurting the interests of Israel, then he's wrong on both counts. Number one, these are not my private policies only. They're policies supported by the overwhelming majority of the Israelis. They support the action that we're taking to destroy the remaining terrorist battalions of Hamas. They say that once we destroy the Hamas, the last thing we should do is put in Gaza, in charge of Gaza, the Palestinian Authority that educates its children towards terrorism and pays for terrorism. And they also support my position that says that we should resoundingly reject the attempt to ram down our throats a Palestinian state. That is something that they agree on, and it's something that I think is also for the interests of Israel, because the majority of Israelis understand that if we don't do this, what we'll have is a repetition of the October 7th massacre, which is bad for Israel, bad for the Palestinians, bad for the future of peace in the Middle East. So the attempt to say that my policies are my private policies that are not supported by most Israelis is false. The vast majority are united as never before, and they understand what's good for Israel. They understand what's important for Israel, and I think they're right.
But again, it's a US president, it's Joe Biden, you know him for 40 years. How does it make you feel that he criticized you so sharply, personally?
I very much appreciate President Biden's support. I think that we've known each other for 40 years. During that time, we've agreed, we've disagreed. During this war, we've talked over a dozen times. We agreed, we disagreed, but we found ourselves in the ability to work together towards two goals. One, destroy Hamas, and second, bring back our hostages. And I hope we continue to find common ground for that purpose. We're doing everything we can to minimize civilian casualties. We're doing everything we can to maximize humanitarian aid. Hamas is getting in the way of both. They want to maximize civilian casualties. They're stealing the aid. So Israel is doing everything in its power to do this, and I think the great majority of Americans understand this. In recent polls, 82% of Americans said that they support Israel in its battle against Hamas. And it's consistent over 5 months. It hasn't changed. And I'm very glad to see that. So I hope that this broad American support will be continued, even though there's a strong minority there, very vocal minority that agitates against Israel. Overwhelmingly, the American people support us, and I hope that President Biden's administration will continue to do the same.
Talking about civilian deaths, you're saying you're doing everything possible to minimize it. Not only Joe Biden is criticizing that. I mean, the reality is we have 30,000 deaths. That's what it looks like. There's a humanitarian crisis with women and children starving. That's what the UN is saying. And I mean, Hamas is still fighting and the hostages are not free. Did your plan fail so far?
No, I think we're very close to victory. It's close at hand. We've destroyed 3/4 of Hamas fighting terrorist battalions, and we're close to finishing the last part in Rafah, and we're not going to give it up, because it's like leaving ISIS, leaving a quarter of ISIS in place, leaving them in charge of parts of Mosul and saying, that's okay. You know it's not okay. They'll reconstitute themselves and start all over again. We'll be back to square one. That's bad for everyone. So we're not going to stop there. But I can tell you one thing. We're doing everything we can to prevent civilian casualties. It's not merely that what I say. Listen to what John Spencer, the head of urban warfare at West Point, the American military academy, is saying. He's saying no army has done what Israel has done to avoid civilian casualties. This is what General Petraeus is saying. He was the commander of U.S. forces in Iraq. He's saying these obstacles no army has faced. And I can tell you that what we're doing, the number of casualties are not civilian casualties. Because how do I know that? Because our forces have killed at least 13,000 terrorist fighters. So the number of civilian casualties is probably on a ratio, began with 1.5 to 1. It's now down to 1 to 1. Mind you, look, every civilian death is a tragedy. But we're doing everything we can to stop that, including dropping leaflets, calling civilians, telling them, we're coming, please leave this area, and so on. So Israel, I think, is setting the gold standard for armies fighting in dense urban warfare with underground terror tunnels against an enemy that is doing everything in its power to keep civilians in harm's way, while we're doing everything in power to get civilians out of harm's way. Israel is setting the gold standard, but it is held to a double standard that no other army has been placed with. And that's not good, that's a problem in international public relations. We recognize that, but it's not going to deter us from continuing the job, keeping civilians as best as we can out of the fighting zones, but finishing the job, because we have to finish the war against Hamas.
It's not only Joe Biden who is criticizing you and who's criticizing the situation on the ground. I quote, German Foreign Minister Baerbock said that the people in Gaza are, quote, closer to dying than to living. Biden called the situation heartbreaking, and UN experts even speak of deliberately starving.
Yeah. Starvation is a terrible thing. It's not.
Is it happening?
It's not. Well, look, we don't have that kind of information. That's not the information we have, and we monitor it closely.
But aren't you responsible for that people are not starving there, and that you need information?
More importantly, it's not our policy. Our policy is to put in as much humanitarian aid as we could. But when we started out putting in the humanitarian convoys, we said there'll be one problem, and that is, what if Hamas tries to steal the food and the drugs that we're bringing for the civilian population for its own terrorist forces? I think the White House said on October 19th, they said, well, if that happens, then the international community will have to stop the aid. It's happened in bundles, but no one is asked to stop the aid, and we haven't stopped it. Instead, what I've looked for is alternative routes, land routes, enabled also parachute drops. And I can tell you that 2 weeks after the beginning of the war, I had my first conversation with President Biden, and I said, let's have a maritime route from Cyprus.
What's happening now with EU? And
yes, and I spoke about it twice more, including in January, where I said, let's set up teams and to facilitate this, providing, of course, that Israel inspects these convoys so they don't include weapons for Hamas. And I'm glad to see it's coming to fruition. So our policy is.
So do you support that, what the EU is doing now?
It's been our policy and our suggestion to place the blame on the interruptions of humanitarian aid at Israel's doorstep, where Hamas is doing everything it can to steal this aid, is not only unfair. It's just it just encourages Hamas to keep on doing this. So we're doing everything we can to supply humanitarian aid. We'll continue to do so, and we'll also continue to do what we can to clear the population in Hamas's remaining stronghold in Rafah, finish those terrorist battalions, and give Gaza a future of peace that it deserves and we deserve.
Why isn't it possible to get in more help through land?
Well, because Hamas is coming at gunpoint and stealing the food, and Hamas is doing everything. They use gunfire. They kill people. They have no problem. For them, the humanitarian deaths and starvation is, for us, it's a tragedy. For them, it's a strategy. They think that this will help them place more pressure on Israel to stop the war, leave them in place so they can repeat the October 7th massacre.
Biden also said some days before that you and him need to have a so-called come to Jesus meeting. Are you ready for that?
I've had frank discussions with President Biden over and over again. Again, I appreciate his help. He's the President of the United States, and he has his own interest. I'm the Prime Minister of Israel, and I have to do what I have to do to assure the security and future of the State of Israel. That security is imperiled if we don't finish the job of destroying the Hamas-Daesh, the Hamas-ISIS terrorist threat. The people of Israel are overwhelmingly united. President Biden doesn't have an argument with me, if he has an argument.
Well, it looks like that he has an argument, because he was criticizing you sharply on TV, and not the first time.
Yeah, okay, they can criticize me, that's fine. But what I'm telling you is that what I represent, the policies that I'm pursuing, are not my private policies. I represent now a vast majority of the people of Israel who are united as never before in our goal to eradicate Hamas and to establish a different future for ourselves and for the Palestinians in Gaza. And I think that deep down, the President of the United States, who's definitely a friend of Israel, who understands that, I think deep down, people understand that. There's a lot of pressure in various countries in the West against Israel finishing this. And you have to ask yourself, where was that pressure when millions of Muslims were either butchered or uprooted for their homes, millions in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen? Where were these demonstrations? You know why the vast majority of Americans, though, don't join this vocal minority? You know why 82% of Americans support Israel in its battle for Hamas? Because they understand that our battle is their battle. They understand that we are the forces of civilization fighting the forces of matchless barbers. They support us, and I'm sure that we'll receive that continued support from the United States government as well.
Would you prefer Trump to be president?
Oh God, the last thing I want to do is enter the American political arena. I have enough politics here, and I don't enter that. I respect the decisions of the American public, and I respect the support that we receive from both, from all administrations. But I want to tell you something. I think we'll enjoy the support of the American people continuously. But if Israel has to stand alone, I don't think it will, but if it needs to, it will. Because our very future, our very survival is at hand. And we're not going to give up the fight until we achieve total victory. We're very close to that. Once we begin the military action against the remaining battalions, terrorist battalions in Rafah, it's a matter of weeks until we complete the intense phase of the fighting. So that's when the war will get much closer to an end.
Mr. Prime Minister, so you took the decision, you're 100% sure that you go into Rafah?
Oh, we'll go there. We're not going to leave them. You know, I have a red line. You know what the red line is? That October 7th doesn't happen again. Never happens again. And to do that, we have to complete the destruction of the Hamas terrorist army. Basically, when I talk to leaders in the region, as I do often, including today, Arab leaders, when I talk to other regions, they understand that. And they even agree with it, quietly, because it's not now comfortable to stand publicly and say you have to get rid of Hamas if we're going to have a better future. But as we do so, and that's something that I not only not disagree with the president, I agree with him completely. We have to do it while enabling the safe evacuation of Palestinians, civilians, to safe borders. Of course they can go.
Wohin?
Of course they can go.
To where?
I mean, Rafah is only 10%, 12% of the entire area of the Gaza Strip. So once we finish the job elsewhere, they can move north of Rafah. There's plenty of space.
All the experts say there's no space anymore.
Well, the experts were wrong when they told us you can't go in. They said you will never get the population out of harm's way, but we did. How come they moved to Rafah? Because we enabled them to move.
But at the same time, you also had 30,000 dead.
As I said, for Hamas that hides behind civilians, that uses them as human shields, it's a strategy. For us, it's a tragedy. But we'll do everything to minimize that tragedy. And again, I ask what any country would do if it had faced the equivalent, in American terms, of 29 11s in one day. 50,000 Americans killed, if you want 10 million Germans killed, 10,000 Germans killed in one day. Thousands of hostages, people raped, beheaded, murdered, babies burned alive. What would you do to prevent that from happening? At least as much as Israel, and probably a lot more.
You said you talked to the Arab leaders, and some of them are quietly supporting your line, let's say. Do they support also that you go into Rafah?
If you really want to compromise them, then I'll tell you what their answer is. They understand that they can't leave Hamas in place. They understand Hamas is part of the Iranian terror axis that threatens them as much as it threatens us, and they want to see that victory. That victory is within reach. We're not far from it.
What does it mean, not far from it? Like how many weeks, months?
Once we begin the intense action of eradicating the Hamas terrorist battalions in Rafah, it's a matter of weeks and not months. That means it's not going to take more than 2 months, maybe 6 weeks, maybe 4.
And Biden also said in this interview that Rafah offensive would be a red line for him.
I don't know if he said that. I'll tell you what, again.
He said that. It's a quote from the interview.
My red line is very simple. We're not going to leave Hamas with the capability of pursuing, perpetrating another Hamas massacre as they did on October 7th. And the only way we can do that is we cannot leave the Hamas terrorist battalions intact. It means that, in fact, we lose the war.
Can you even fight Rafah without the support of the U.S.?
Yes, I mean, we prefer to have that support, and I believe we enjoy the support of the vast majority of the American people. By the way, not only do the vast majority support us, the vast majority also say that Israel is taking pains to avoid civilian casualties. So the media hype and the argument of the vocal minority doesn't necessarily register, at least in the United States, with the majority. But the more important thing is to understand we can bring this whole tragedy to a close by having a quick victory, a victory in which we enable the people to move to safe zones through safe corridors, enable the entrance of humanitarian aid, which I've initiated and I've pushed forward, and Hamas has tried to interdict. And we can do this, and we can bring an end to Hamas terrorist rule in Gaza and bring a great victory for the civilized world.
Ramadan is starting next week, and still people discussing a possible ceasefire next week. Do you still see a chance for that?
Well, I'd certainly like to see another hostage release, and I've instructed our people to be forthcoming in the discussions that we've had in Paris. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that Hamas has hardened its positions, probably because it's assuming that the international ganging up on Israel will somehow not require to make any concessions. So they maintain their outlandish demands, which they know are not going to go anywhere. So unfortunately, we don't see a breakthrough in the negotiations as much as we want to see it. And without a release, where there's not going to be a pause in the fighting.
So what are the points, the key points why it's not happening? Is it because they don't want to release the hostages?
Yeah, well, they don't come back with anything. In fact, it's been weeks since the meetings in Paris, and whereas we were glad to move forward, they move backward. They don't go anywhere.
What is the strategy there?
Their strategy? Their strategy is to have the international pressure basically mount on Israel and have the international community stop Israel from pursuing the final defeat of Hamas forces, to regroup, recapture the Gaza Strip, and start all over again. The October 7th massacre and the other wars that they will start with the Houthis and with Hezbollah and so on. That's what they're hoping for. And when the international community, those in the international community, support Hamas, they should understand they're not only supporting these mass murderers, these rapists, these baby burners, they're supporting those who want to set back the Middle East to the early medieval times against Israel and the democratic world and the moderate Arab states who want to see it move forward. And so we don't lose our sight. The people of Israel understand this very well. And I think ultimately, when we achieve this victory, as we will, as we must, I think the rest of the world will join in.
What do you know about the hostages, the Israeli hostages? Do you know where they are and what is happening to them?
I don't think it makes sense for me to itemize that. This is one of the most excruciating issues faced by any government. I'm glad that we were able to achieve the release of half of the hostages to date, and we're committed to getting the release of the remainder. It's a great challenge. But I don't see the release of the hostages and the defeat of Hamas as being mutually exclusive. In fact, I see them as being absolutely dependent on one another. If we don't defeat Hamas, we will not release the hostages. If we do, we will.
What does defeating Hamas mean? Kill the leader? Do you know where the leader is, where Shinwar is?
Well, we'll get to them eventually, but it's not only the leadership. I think on this, it's clear. I mean, President Biden actually said something that on this that I think is important. He said Hamas should lay down their arms, surrender, release all the hostages. That would end the war fairly quickly. I can tell you that that's one way that the war would end. There are other ways, but it means ending Hamas as a practical fighting and governing force in Gaza, and it's possible to do. We're well on our way to doing it.
We still see international support for Hamas. For example, Turkey's President Erdogan said, "We stand behind Hamas." How do you deal with that?
Well, the last thing I do is receive any moral preachings from Erdogan, who refuses to call Hamas, that committed the worst terrorist outrage since perpetrated on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. He refuses to call them a terrorist organization. He supports these mass murderers and rapists, and I think it's just outrageous. So I don't expect anything from Erdogan at this point.
So, but again, how will you know that you have achieved your goal of destroying Hamas? What is the point where you say this is victory?
Well, you know it very clearly. If you can move, if people can move in Gaza without fear of having their brains blown out by Hamas, because we effectively eliminated it as a governing and fighting force. And you know that. That's very easy. You destroy their fighting formations, you do mop-up operation, you destroy their underground vast terror infrastructure. We're doing all that. When we complete these three tasks, eliminating the organized fighting formations, mopping up the remaining terrorists, and destroying their underground infrastructure, you'll have victory. And we're close.
Will there ever be a Palestinian state as long as you have saying in that matter?
I think it's not merely, again, people are trying to persuade the public opinion that the positions of Israel, there's a position of the Israeli public and there's a position of Netanyahu, me. No, that's not what's happening. The positions that I espouse are supported by the overwhelming majority of Israelis who say to you after October 7th, we don't want to see a Palestinian state, for the simple reason that the Hamas massacre was started from a de facto Palestinian state in Gaza. We don't want to see a Palestinian state because 85% of the Palestinians under PA control, not under Hamas control, under PA control, support the massacre. We don't want to see a Palestinian state because that state must not have an army. It mustn't have the ability to bring in weapons into its areas. It cannot sign pacts with Iran. It should educate their children for peace. None of that is happening. They don't see that happening. And they say, what are we going to reward the Palestinians who are espousing these extreme positions, whose leader doesn't even condemn 5 months after the massacre?
But how can there ever be peace if there's no two-state solution? Because that's what everyone in Germany would say.
They would say it. Yeah. They would say it, but they don't understand that the reason we don't have peace is not because the Palestinians don't have a state. It's because the Jews have a state. And in fact, the Palestinians have not brought themselves to recognize and accept a Jewish state and continue to use any territory given to them as a staging ground for the elimination of the one and only Jewish state. That's why I've said that if we have a change of leadership, down the line, a change of culture down the line, something we haven't seen from the Palestinian Authority in any way, but if we were to have it, then I would say the Palestinians should have all the powers to govern themselves, but none of the powers to threaten Israel. That means that the overriding security responsibility in the area west of the Jordan River should remain in Israel's hands. That's the only way that you can secure. And that doesn't mean, that means necessarily a detraction of Palestinian sovereignty.
Last question, Mr. Prime Minister. There's a discussion about the north ongoing, about the risk of Hezbollah and about the risk of a bigger war. How likely is that from your perspective?
Look, no Israeli government can tolerate a situation where 100,000 of its citizens are refugees in their own land. They've left their homes because of the fear, concern that Hezbollah would perpetrate the massacres in the northern border with Lebanon that Hamas perpetrated in the border with Gaza. So we'll do whatever we can to restore security for them and bring them home. And I hope we can do that. If we have to do it with military means, we'll do so. If there's a diplomatic way to achieve it, fine. But ultimately, we'll do it.
Thank you very much for your time, Mr. Prime Minister. Thank you.
Thank you.